Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we'll spend some time with an old and quiet question, one that has floated through books, maps, and conversations for a very long time. We'll slowly wander through the idea of Atlantis, the lost city that seems to sit just beyond the edge of certainty, always half in shadow, always just out of reach. If you enjoy these calm journeys through forgotten places and enduring mysteries, you can subscribe and return whenever you'd like something soft to listen to. And if you feel like it, you might leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight, or what gentle subject you'd like to visit next. For now, let the room settle around you. Let the sounds around you become small and distant. We'll keep the pace unhurried, the lights low and the questions open as we drift toward the sea and toward the long memory of a city that may have never been lost at all, but simply imagined so vividly that it became part of the world. On a quiet night, Atlantis is easy to picture, not in one fixed way because the city has never stayed still. In one telling, it is a glittering island kingdom ringed by canals, shining towers, and strong walls of stone and metal. In another, it is a great civilization with orderly fields, temples, harbors, and broad avenues, a place where ships moved through calm waters and people measured their world by tide, trade, and ritual. In still other versions, it becomes more distant and dreamlike, less a city than a symbol, a place that stands for beauty, pride, decline, and the slow uncertainty of memory. That is part of what makes Atlantis so easy to revisit in the evening. It has shape, but not one shape. It has history, but also atmosphere. It feels old, yet it is never quite pinned down. It can be approached as a legend, as a philosophical story, as an archaeological puzzle, or as a kind of shared dream that has traveled across centuries without losing its softness. The earliest surviving account comes from Plato, who wrote about Atlantis in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias. He described it as a powerful island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a name usually linked to the Strait of Gibraltar. According to the account, Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, though those names meant different things in the ancient world than they do now. It was wealthy, organized, and technologically impressive in its own way, with a central acropolis, rings of land and water, and a society that had grown proud and expansive. Plato's story is never simply a travel report. It is also a moral reflection, the kind of story that asks the listener to think carefully about greatness. In his telling, the Atlanteans begin with discipline and divine favor, but over time they grow more ambitious and less balanced. They become absorbed in their own strength. Then, in a single day and night of misfortune, earthquakes and floods bring the island down beneath the sea. The image is so vivid that it can feel like a memory. Yet Plato was writing philosophy, not a modern historical survey. He was shaping an example, using a lost city to explore ideas about virtue, power, and the fate of societies that forget restraint. Even so, the story left a deep impression. Once it appeared on the page, it began its long life in the imagination of later readers, who would revisit it again and again, each time seeing something slightly different in the shape of the ruins. It is calming in a way to think about how a story can be carried so far by the human mind. A city may sink, a coastline may vanish, a harbor may silt up, but a narrative can keep traveling. It can pass from one language to another, from one era to another, changing its color as it goes and still feel alive. Atlantis has done exactly that. It has moved through the centuries like a lantern underwater, dim but not extinguished. Some readers have treated Plato's account as a coded memory of real events. They have wondered whether a dramatic volcanic eruption, a tsunami, or a catastrophic flood might lie behind the tale. Others have looked for traces of a lost island in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, or even farther away. The island of Thera, also known as Santorini, often enters the conversation because of the immense eruption that struck the region in the ancient world. Minoan civilization, centered on Crete and nearby islands, was deeply affected by the sea, by trade, and by seismic power. It is easy to see why such places invite comparison. and yet the comparison never quite settles into certainty. Santorini is real, ancient and astonishing, with its cliffs, its caldera and the buried remains of Akrotiri. The Minoans are also real, and their world is one of the most elegant and fascinating in the Bronze Age Aegean. But Atlantis remains something else as well, something more fluid, because the story was never only about geography. It was about an idealized city, a cautionary tale, a mirror held up to the listener. Still, the search has its own quiet charm. Human beings often feel drawn to places that seem to have stepped out of the map. A lost city invites both rigor and reverie. Archaeologists look for layers of soil, pottery, architecture, and signs of change. Readers of myth look for meanings in the shapes of the story itself. Both approaches can coexist gently. One looks down into the earth, the other outward into memory, and both are trying to understand what remains after time has done its work. There is something especially peaceful about the sea in these stories, because the sea is not just a setting, but a kind of slow keeper of secrets. It receives things, it covers them, it moves over them in patient darkness. A city that sinks beneath the sea enters a very different state of being. It is no longer crowded with footsteps, echoes, or daily noise. It becomes still, almost ceremonial. Light touches it differently. Fish may drift where people once walked. Sand may gather in corners that once held statues, hearths, or offerings. This is probably why underwater ruins have such lasting power over the imagination. They combine two opposites, presence and absence. A column still stands, but its roof is gone. A wall is visible, but its neighborhood is missing. A road may continue for a few meters and then dissolve into silt. The ruin does not fully vanish. It lingers. It allows us to feel both loss and endurance at the same time. Atlantis, in that sense, is less a single location than a special kind of silence. It is the silence of depth, of distance, of things carried away. And because it is quiet, people have been able to project so much into it. Some imagine shining white stone. Others imagine bronze gates, gardens, libraries, domes, and seawalls engraved with forgotten patterns. Some place it in warm water under bright skies. Others picture it under storm clouds just before the final wave arrives. The city accepts all of these versions without protest. When a story survives for this long, it often gathers layers of interpretation. In the classical world, Atlantis was one thing. In the Renaissance, it became another. Later centuries turned it into a lost technological civilization, a spiritual homeland, a moral warning, a scientific problem, and a romantic ruin. Each age found a different reflection in the same deep pool. That changing reflection is not unusual. Many famous places work like this. Troy was once a poem before it was an archaeological site. The city of El Dorado was once a quest before it became a symbol. Camelot lives somewhere between history and longing. Atlantis belongs to that same family of impossible places, where evidence and imagination sit close together, and neither one fully pushes the other away. If we listen carefully, the Atlantis story also says something about how people respond to scale. A vast city, a powerful kingdom, an island rising from the sea, all of these are large enough to inspire awe. But the ending reduces everything to a single event. Earth shakes, water rises, the known world is transformed. It is a reminder that even the grandest human works are held within larger natural forces. Stone may look enduring, but coastlines move, continents shift. Seas advance and retreat. Settlements that once seemed permanent may one day be remembered only by broken walls and local names. And yet the calmness of the story comes partly from the fact that it is already in the past. No one listening tonight needs to race toward the island or solve it before morning. Atlantis can remain unresolved. It can rest in its unanswered state. The absence of a final proof does not diminish the story for this hour. In some ways, it deepens it. A mystery that stays open can be more soothing than a mystery that closes too quickly. It leaves room for thought without demanding strain. The ancient Mediterranean was full of people who lived with the sea every day. They knew its trade routes, its storms, its harbors, and its risks. They built ports, watched the horizon, and understood that water connected islands as often as it separated them. In such a world, the image of an island city swallowed by the sea would have carried a particular force. It would not have been an abstract fantasy. It would have been something close enough to fear and close enough to believe. There are also echoes of other traditions in the Atlantis tale, though they are not the same thing. Flood stories appear in many cultures. Some tell of divine judgment, some of renewal, some of cycles of destruction and rebirth. The sea becomes a boundary, and then it becomes a cleaner. It removes what came before so that something else may begin. Atlantis does not belong entirely to any one flood story, but it sits comfortably among them, a Western island version of a much older human intuition that the world is changeable and that memory is fragile. If you are listening late at night, that idea may feel especially soft. The mind at this hour often drifts toward the edges of maps and eras. It wonders what was built before, what was buried, what was left behind in another century, another climate, another way of living. Atlantis answers none of those questions directly, but it gives them a home. It is a vessel for wandering. Some modern retellings lean into wonder with bright metallic towers and advanced machinery. Others prefer a more natural image, a civilization in balance with the sea, gardens spilling over terraces and temples looking toward the horizon. There is a strange comfort in how flexible the city remains. Because no single version can claim total authority, the listener is free to imagine gently. The city can be as simple or as elaborate as needed for the mood of the evening. And perhaps that is one reason Atlantis has never faded. It is not preserved by evidence alone, but by adaptability. It can enter a conversation about ocean archaeology, a lecture on Plato, a children's bedtime story, a fantasy map, or a meditation on loss and still seem at home. It is a myth with enough structure to feel real and enough openness to remain mysterious. As we move further into the night, it may help to picture the city not in a dramatic flash but in fragments. A staircase descending into blue water, a harbour wall softened by current, a circular street seen through a wavering surface, a carved stone arch, its edges covered in pale growth, a quiet school of fish moving through what was once a public square. These small images are enough. They do not need to be arranged into certainty. In many ways, ruins are already a form of gentleness. They no longer insist on function. They no longer demand attendance. They simply remain. And when a ruin lies beneath the sea, even that remaining becomes slower, more hushed, more dreamlike. The pressure of water turns every outline into something softened. Corners blur, edges fade. The world becomes less like a map and more like a memory half remembered after waking. It is worth pausing for a moment on the idea of Plato's purpose because it changes the atmosphere of the story. He was not trying to sell a grand adventure. He was asking his readers to consider the health of a city, the habits of its people, and the relationship between virtue and power. Atlantis stands beside a more famous and more stable city in his dialogue, an idealized Athens, and the comparison is deliberate. One city remains aligned with moderation, the other falls into excess. The contrast matters more than the geography. So if Atlantis is partly a lesson, it is a lesson wrapped in water and stone. That may be why it has remained memorable. People often remember stories that give abstract ideas a physical shape. A city can be imagined, a sinking can be imagined, pride, disorder, and collapse can be seen happening in a landscape. This makes the thought easier to carry, even when the conclusion is not simple. And still, the desire to find the city persists. There is nothing wrong with that desire. Human beings like to look for traces. We like to connect a story to a shoreline to a cliff to a volcano to a date in the calendar. We like to say perhaps here, perhaps there, perhaps this explains it. Sometimes those guesses bring us closer to truth. Sometimes they reveal only how deeply we want the story to touch the ground. The island could also be understood as a boundary figure, something sitting between worlds. It is land but isolated. It is real but removed. It is a civilization, but one that belongs to the far side of disaster. That sense of being between states makes it especially fitting for nighttime listening. Night is itself a boundary, a threshold between activity and rest, between clarity and drift. Atlantis, with its uncertain edges, belongs naturally there. You might imagine the city at different moments in its life. Early morning on a harbour quay, with ropes creaking softly against the dock. Midday in a market where people trade grain, oil, woven cloth and bright ceramics. Evening in a temple courtyard where lamps are lit and the air smells of salt and resin. Then, much later, another kind of hour with water rising over the same streets and silence replacing speech. The contrast is part of the power of the legend. Sometimes when a place is said to be lost, what is really lost is access, not existence. The buildings may remain below the seabed. The outline may still be there in sediment or in geological memory, but for human life, lost is often enough. We cannot walk there, we cannot see it without effort. We must rely on instruments, descriptions, fragments, and interpretation. That distance itself becomes part of the enchantment. And if no physical Atlantis is ever found, the story still endures in another way. It survives as a map of longing. It survives in literature, art, games, scholarship, and conversation. It becomes a shared place where curiosity can rest for a while. That is not a failure of the myth. It is one of its achievements. The sea outside a harbour at night can feel vast even when it is calm. A lost city beneath that sea becomes even vaster in the mind. One can imagine the black water over the stones, the pressure, the slow motion of silt settling over inscriptions. Time underwater has a different pace. It does not rush, it coats. It preserves some things, erodes others, and changes everything else in patient layers. Perhaps that is a useful way to think about memory in general. Not everything is erased, not everything is recovered. Some things survive as shape, some as feeling, some as story. Atlantis survives in all three. There is the shape of the city, however uncertain. There is the feeling of wonder and loss. And there is the story passed quietly from one listener to another. If we imagine standing on a dark shore and looking toward where the city might have been, the scene is simple. Water, distance, sky, a faint line where the horizon disappears. Maybe a few lights from a harbour in another place. Maybe the sound of waves touching stones. There does not need to be more. The legend is large enough to fill the silence without effort. And so we continue, not toward a final answer, but toward a softer understanding of why the question remains. Atlantis endures because it sits at the meeting point of history and imagination, disaster and elegance, philosophy and dream. It is a lost city only in one sense. In another, it has never been more present, because it keeps returning whenever people think about the sea, about vanished places, and about the strange beauty of things that cannot quite be proved. In some late accounts and speculative retellings, Atlantis is given walls of remarkable materials, as if the city needed to be more than stone in order to seem worthy of the water around it. But the old power of the story does not depend on opulence. Even a modest island town, if lost in a storm, can become myth. What matters is the feeling that an entire way of life slipped beneath a surface and stayed there, just out of sight. It is also interesting how often Atlantis is spoken of in the present tense when people are discussing it, as though the city is still waiting somewhere beneath the waves. That habit of speech keeps the story alive. We say it is there, or there may be, or perhaps it was. The verbs hover. They do not settle. This is useful for a bedtime story because the mind can drift inside uncertainty without strain. The city is both gone and near. The ancient world itself was full of places that seemed to disappear and reappear depending on who was telling the tale. Harbours shifted, sandbars moved, earthquakes changed coastlines. A traveller might return to a familiar port and find the shoreline altered, the water deeper, the buildings farther back from the edge. To a person living without modern surveying tools, the land could feel alive and unstable in a way we sometimes forget. Atlantis magnifies that experience until it becomes legend. And in the quiet of the evening, that instability can feel oddly restful. There is no pressure to solve it right now, no need to pin down the exact route, the exact date, the exact island. Instead, we can simply let the idea settle like a shell in the palm of the hand. Its surface is smooth from long handling. Its origin is still debated, but it remains beautiful to hold. There are scholars who have spent careers separating Plato's literary purpose from later embellishments. There are others who have explored the historical contexts that may have inspired the tale. There are geologists, archaeologists, classicists, and historians who each approach the problem from a slightly different angle. This variety is comforting in its own way. It means the story has enough depth to invite multiple forms of attention. Not every mystery has that generosity. Sometimes the best way to appreciate Atlantis is simply to notice what the legend encourages us to imagine: broad ceremonial roads, water channels, a central hill crowned with a temple, gates that catch the light, walls that reflect the sea, people who live in a city that seems ordered and complete until the order proves to be only temporary. These are not certainties, they are scenes, and scenes are often enough for an evening. The sea, after all, is not only a place of loss, it is also a place of connection. Ships cross it, trade depends on it, stories travel across it. The same water that covers a ruin can carry a message, a grain shipment, a pilgrim, a rumor, a melody. Atlantis, despite its sinking, belongs to that larger movement. The story has crossed oceans of language and time. It has become a passenger rather than a location. That may be the most peaceful thought of all. A city can vanish, and yet its image can keep moving. It can drift through thought like a lantern through fog, never entirely fixed, never entirely extinguished. The listener does not need to reach it. The act of listening is enough. So let the city remain under the water for now. Let the old walls stay wrapped in current. Let the lost roads continue in the mind, silent and complete in their incompleteness. There is no rush, the night is generous, the questions can rest. And as the story softens, we can imagine the final view not as a catastrophe, but as a dim and beautiful threshold. The sea above, the city below. Between them, layers of time, all moving slowly, all listening in their own way. Atlantis remains there, not because it has been found, but because it has never quite stopped being imagined. In that imagined darkness, there is no alarm, no urgency, only depth. The water covers what it will. The quiet holds what it can, and the old story continues, one gentle wave at a time. Below that imagined darkness, there is still more to wonder about, and the wonder itself can be soft. Some legends do not insist on being solved at once. They simply wait, like sealed rooms in a forgotten palace, or like the last light in a harbour after the ships have gone to sleep. Atlantis has that quality. It seems to invite not only curiosity but patience. If we stay with the oldest telling for a little longer, the one preserved by Plato, we find that the story is not only about a city, it is also about memory, measure, and moral balance. The Atlanteans are described as powerful, prosperous, and greatly favoured. They build with care. They organise their island into rings. They draw strength from sea and land. But as the story goes on, their wealth becomes burdened by pride, and their gifts are used without restraint. The collapse comes not as a sudden shock alone, but as the ending to a long inward turning. It is the kind of ending that ancient storytellers often knew how to shape. A civilization does not only fall from the outside. It can also lose its center from within. That is one reason the legend has endured so peacefully in the imagination. It is never just a map under the water. It is also a parable of balance. The sea may cover the stones, but the deeper lesson stays near the surface of the mind. Many ancient cultures told stories of greatness followed by ruin. Mesopotamian epics remember cities that could not outlast the will of the gods. Biblical narratives speak of towers, floods, and scattered peoples. Greek myths often look at the line between human ambition and divine limit. Atlantis belongs to that broad family of stories where splendor is real but permanence is not. And yet, despite its warning, Atlantis is not a harsh story. It glows. It has columns and harbors, bulls and temples, concentric circles of water, and a sheen of metals that sound almost ceremonial in the telling. The very details that make it sound impossible are also the details that make it memorable. The mind is drawn to symmetry. It is drawn to bright surfaces in dark water. It is drawn to the idea of an architecture so complete that even its disappearance seems strangely elegant. There is something calming in the way myths preserve scale. Atlantis is large enough to feel important, but distant enough to remain safe. It can hold the imagination without asking us to do anything except look. And looking in a quiet room is a restful act. The eyes can close. The mind can continue softly on its own. Many people have tried to place Atlantis on a real map. Some have looked toward the Mediterranean, seeing echoes in the Thera eruption and the Minoan civilization of Crete. That catastrophe, which reshaped the Aegean world, is among the most haunting in ancient history. A volcanic island changed the sea, and ash drifted, and coastal societies had to adapt. The Minoans themselves were not Atlantis, of course, but their sophisticated palaces, maritime reach, and eventual decline have made them part of the long conversation around lost civilizations. A real event can leave behind just enough shape for later imagination to walk around inside it. Others have looked farther west or south, or even beyond the Mediterranean entirely. Some search the marshes and coasts of Spain. Some inspect Atlantic shelves and submerged plains. Some consider whether ancient flood memories preserved in different cultures may have accumulated into a grander legend. There are many routes of speculation, and each one has its own quiet charm. The human mind, when it cannot find a single answer, often begins to make a landscape out of possibilities. Atlantis becomes not just one place, but an atmosphere of inquiry. The nicest part is that the inquiry itself is often gentle, a fragment of text, a line in an old translation, a comparison with another myth, a map with a suspicious curve, a seabed survey, a hint of a ruined wall. Each piece is small, but together they create a kind of twilight archaeology. Not all archaeology is dusty trenches under bright sun. Sometimes it is listening to old reports and allowing them to echo. There is, too, the matter of time, which in the story of Atlantis feels especially deep. Civilizations rise and become accustomed to their own continuity. Their markets open each day. Their wells are filled. Their children learn the shape of the streets. Their rituals repeat. It can feel from inside the moment as though the present has a sturdy foundation. But history is patient in a way people are not. Earthquakes, political change, migrations, droughts, storms, war, trade shifts, and cultural transformations all work slowly until one day the familiar arrangement no longer holds. Atlantis, whether literal or symbolic, reminds us that the world can change more than we expect. And still, the story does not ask us to be afraid. It only asks us to notice. To notice how fragile systems can be, how beautiful cities are in their briefness, how a shoreline is never as fixed as a line on a page. Even stone wears down. Even a harbour can silt up. Even a river can choose a new path. The ancients knew this in practical ways. They saw cities altered by floods and rebuilds, by the movement of trade, by the rise and fall of dynasties. Their worlds were not static. They lived with change more closely than we sometimes do. There is a certain tenderness in imagining those older coastlines, a place where a quay once extended into blue water, a set of stairs now half submerged, a warehouse that once held jars of oil or grain, a temple terrace where incense smoke rose into warm air. The water would have lapped against pilings and stones, making a small repetitive sound that might have seemed ordinary at the time. Ordinary things become mysterious when the years collect around them. This is one reason lost cities hold us so quietly. They transform the everyday into the luminous. Plato's Atlantis also carries an unusual literary neatness. It is framed as a tale passed down through generations, moving from one voice to another, each retelling preserving and altering it slightly. This chain of transmission matters. Many ancient stories survive not as perfect records, but as layered recollections. They come to us through editors, translators, copyists, commentators, and readers. Each layer is like a thin sheet of translucent paper over a drawing. The shape remains visible but softened. Atlantis itself has become a story of layers, a philosophical dialogue, a later legend, an archaeological possibility, a modern symbol, a dream repeated in many accents. That layering makes the story suitable for a sleepy mind. You do not need to hold all versions at once. You can let them settle one over another like calm water in a still basin. The edges blur, the surface smooths. A phrase from one source touches a speculation from another. A real ruin somewhere in the Mediterranean touches a fictional palace far away. The brain in the late hours is especially skilled at this kind of soft association. It does not need certainty to create meaning. It only needs permission to wander gently. In some of the later traditions inspired by Atlantis, the city becomes almost a mirror for the reader's own age. Writers have used it to reflect imperial ambition, technological confidence, moral decline, environmental catastrophe, or the fear that knowledge itself can outgrow wisdom. The details change, but the central image remains. A brilliant society, perhaps too sure of its own strength, becomes vulnerable to the forces it underestimated. This theme is old, but it never feels exhausted. Each generation finds a fresh reason to look down into the water and wonder what was lost. The ocean is especially good at keeping secrets. It covers shipwrecks in sand. It hides coastline changes beneath currents. It erases sharp edges slowly, not all at once. A wreck becomes a reef. A ruin becomes a field of broken stones. A city, if it truly fell near water, may leave behind only the faintest trace, a foundation, a line of pottery, an anomaly in the sediment. The sea is not malicious. It is simply persistent. It rearranges what it touches. It turns the visible into the half-visible. It invites the imagination to complete what cannot be seen. That is why underwater archaeology feels so compelling even to those who never dive. The idea that history can lie beneath the surface, intact yet altered, gives the past a second climate. Light behaves differently there. Silence behaves differently there. A chamber once full of voices can become a resting place for fish. A stairway can become a slope for sea grass. A carved face can gather a delicate bloom of algae. The transformation is not cruel, it is just another chapter of time. Atlantis, in that sense, is an underwater metaphor for memory itself. What is remembered clearly? What is blurred? What sinks? What remains visible because it is repeatedly retold? A family story can become Atlantis in miniature. So can a forgotten city name in a chronicle, a ruin with no inscription, a song whose origin is uncertain. We carry submerged things all the time. Some are private, some are collective. The legend simply makes that condition grand and ancient. There is also pleasure in the city's architecture as a kind of repeating pattern. Rings of land and water, a center surrounded by circles. This shape feels ceremonial, almost meditative. The eye moves inward and outward. It does not get trapped. It follows a rhythm. Ancient builders often understood the emotional power of enclosure and sequence. Temples, palaces, processional roads, courtyards, and waterworks could all guide the body through an experience of order. Even if Atlantis was imagined rather than built, the image itself uses that same calming geometry. The mind can enter it slowly. And within that geometry, we can imagine small moments of life. A scribe leaning over a tablet, a child watching boats return at dusk, a market seller arranging shells, spices, cloth, or bronze tools, a priest walking toward a sanctuary in the cool morning, a mason lifting wet stone into place. These details are not from Plato's exact text. They are quiet additions, but they help the city breathe. Lost places become more vivid when they are allowed ordinary routines. Grandeur is not enough by itself. A civilization feels real when someone has swept its floors, carried its water, waited at its gate, or rested under its roof. The ancient world was full of such layered cities. There were ceremonial capitals, trading ports, fortified hill towns, temple complexes, and administrative centers. Some were built beside rivers that changed course. Some were abandoned after conquest or climate shifts. Some were transformed so thoroughly by later occupation that only their foundations remain. In this broader field, Atlantis is not an outlier but an intensification. It gathers many historical experiences into one luminous emblem. It is a city condensed from the long history of rise, adaptation, decline, and remembrance. Even the uncertainty around Atlantis can be soothing because uncertainty leaves room. If the answer were too fixed, the story would close. But because the city remains unresolved, the imagination may continue to move through it. One reader sees a volcanic island, another sees a drowned shoreline, another sees a moral allegory. Another sees only a beautiful set of concentric rings glinting under moonlit water. The lack of finality is not a flaw here. It is the reason the story remains alive. And if we drift farther back into the deep past, we can remember that many cultures carried flood traditions, sunken lands, or vanished golden ages. Such stories appear in different forms around the world. A deluge can be a cleansing, a punishment, a renewal, or a memory of real disaster turned mythic. A lost land can represent innocence, wealth, or ancestral proximity to the divine. These tales are cousins to Atlantis. They show how deeply humans have long associated water with both origin and disappearance. Rivers nourish, seas conceal. Rain revives, floods overwhelm. In myth, water is rarely neutral. It is change made visible. The Greek imagination in particular often treated the boundary between human achievement and the forces beyond it with a certain beautiful caution. Heroes built splendid things, but fate waited nearby. Cities flourished, but oracles spoke of endings. Temples were raised, yet the gods remained larger than any wall. Atlantis fits neatly into this atmosphere. It is grand enough to inspire awe, but not so grand that it escapes the ancient lesson of measure. It reminds us that brilliance without balance can drift toward ruin. Still, there is no need to linger only on collapse. The same story that carries loss also carries craft. Someone had to imagine the city in enough detail to tell it. Someone had to picture the rings, the metals, the canals, the harbour, the palace, the mountain. That act of imagining is itself a kind of preservation. Even if no stone ever rose exactly as described, the image has travelled farther than many real monuments. It has survived libraries burning, empires changing, languages shifting, and centuries of reinterpretation. Not all cities are made of brick and mortar. Some are made of sustained attention. The bedtime mind can rest inside that attention. It can follow the slow movement of a historian comparing texts. It can sit with a geologist reading the shape of a basin. It can imagine an ancient mariner hearing of a rich island in the far west. It can picture a philosopher shaping a cautionary dialogue. It can watch the legend pass from one century to the next, never entirely resting, never entirely lost. There is a small and lovely paradox in all of this. Atlantis is a lost city, and yet its loss is what keeps it close. If it had been found quickly and settled into a single confirmed location, it might have become simply another ruin, remarkable but bounded. Instead, it remains open, and because it remains open, it can receive more thought. It becomes a vessel for contemplation. A place can be unreachable and still intimate. Sometimes the distance is what allows affection to deepen. We may imagine then that somewhere beneath the surface or somewhere in the mind's submerged chambers, the city continues in a quieter mode. No bells ring, no crowds hurry, no armies march, the harbour is still. The temple steps are dim. The water moves over everything with the steady patience of centuries. Fish pass where processions once moved. Silt settles where thresholds once stood. The city does not protest. It has become part of the sea's long memory. That image can be comforting if we let it be. Not every ending is violent. Some are gradual enough to resemble sleep. A lamp dims, voices lower, footsteps recede. A page is turned. A tide comes in. Even a vanished city can enter a kind of rest. And perhaps that is why Atlantis keeps returning in so many forms. People are drawn not only to what is lost, but to the idea that loss can still be held in beauty. A ruin at twilight, a fragment of marble in a museum case, a sentence quoted by a later writer, a submerged wall traced by sonar, a map made by someone who wanted the missing place to be real. Each one says in its own quiet way that forgetting is never complete, so the city drifts on. Not as a problem to solve before sleep, but as a companion for the drifting mind. It carries the perfume of old libraries, the salt of ancient seas, the cool of shaded stone, the soft pressure of unanswered questions. It belongs to philosophy and folklore, to archaeology and wonder, to history and dream. It belongs to the deep places where human beings keep their most persistent stories. And if the night grows stiller, we may let the image grow simpler too. No need for elaborate theories now. No need to search the map. Just a far horizon, a calm sea, and beneath it a city of rings and halls, resting in darkness with all its gates closed and all its stories intact. The water above remains gently moving. The old world below remains gently silent. Between them, time itself feels like something that can be listened to but not hurried. So the legend softens once more. The city is lost, and the loss is not sharp. It is vast, and the vastness is kind. The sea holds the shape of it, the centuries hold the echo of it, and the mind, growing quiet, can let it remain exactly where it is, half seen, half sung, and peacefully asleep beneath the deep blue dark. But Atlantis does not only belong to the sea, it also belongs to the human habit of looking back. Across many old cultures, there is a familiar longing for a first age, a time when people were said to live closer to the gods, or closer to wisdom, or simply closer to a more orderly world. The Greeks had stories of golden ages. Other traditions remembered great floods, vanished lands, and cities that sank beneath water or were carried away by divine displeasure. These myths were not always meant as maps. Sometimes they were warnings. Sometimes they were meditations on change. Sometimes they were ways of saying that even the strongest works of humankind remain delicate when set against the larger motion of the world. In Plato's telling, Atlantis was a place of great prosperity, but prosperity alone did not make it wise. The story carries a measured, almost cool judgment. The island kingdom was advanced, wealthy, and impressive, yet it lost its balance. In that sense, the tale has the feeling of an old moral mirror. It reflects the calm idea that power without restraint does not stay still for long. It shifts, it softens, it breaks apart, and the sea, which has no interest in human pride, quietly receives what is left. The details of the island are part of its lingering charm. Plato speaks of rings of water and land, of canals, of a central acropolis, of temples adorned with metalwork and precious stones. He describes a civilization with order in its streets and grandeur in its buildings. The image is vivid enough to feel inhabited, and yet restrained enough to remain dreamlike. It is not a full travel account. It is a philosophical city composed with care. We can imagine its avenues at dawn, when the light would have fallen on stone and bronze in a pale, low shimmer. We can imagine its harbors before the day grew busy, before ships set out, before markets opened, before the whole island filled with movement and speech. There is something restful in imagining ancient life at ordinary pace. Not every moment must be dramatic. Even the great civilizations of the past were made of patient repetition. Bread was baked, nets were mended, water was carried, tablets were inscribed. Children learned the shape of family names. Priests tended sanctuaries. Craftspeople worked metals and clay. The wide histories we read now were once lived one small day at a time. Atlantis, if it had ever existed in the world outside philosophy, would have been no different. Its grandeur would have rested on everyday labor. Its beauty would have depended on ordinary hands. That is one reason the lost city feels so close. It is easy to imagine monumental collapse, but it is just as easy to imagine a quieter continuity. Someone sweeping a courtyard, someone repairing a roof, someone pausing to listen to gulls over the harbor, someone walking past carved pillars without thinking that the city beneath their feet might one day become legend. History often looks most dramatic in retrospect. While it is happening, it usually feels like daily life. And daily life is full of small textures that the mind can soften around at night. The roughness of stone steps worn smooth by many feet, the coolness of a shaded cistern, the smell of fish and salt and oil near the docks, the sound of bronze tools on wood, the hush inside a temple before dawn offerings. These details belong to many ancient places, not only to Atlantis, and perhaps that is part of the legend's quiet power. It gathers together the atmosphere of the ancient Mediterranean, the feeling of old coastal civilization, and gives it a single glowing name. The sea itself has always played a patient role in human memory. It erases, but it also preserves. A submerged wall may wait in darkness for centuries. A shipwreck can rest almost untouched, sealed in silt, keeping pottery, metal, and wood in a deep and silent archive. Saltwater is not kind to all things, but the seabed can be strangely tender in its own way. It covers, it cushions, it holds, and because it holds, it becomes a place where stories continue even after the people who began them are gone. Modern archaeology has learned to listen to these underwater archives with remarkable care. Sonar maps, submersible cameras, remote sensing, careful excavation beneath the waves. Each discovery is both modest and astonishing. A harbour wall here, a submerged road there. The foundation of a port once thought to be only a name. Real submerged cities do exist in the world, and they remind us that the boundary between legend and history is not always as clean as we might think. Earthquakes, tsunamis, rising seas, coastal subsidence, river shifts, all of these can alter a shoreline until an old settlement becomes a memory in deep water. The sea does not need to be magical to be transformative, and yet myth reaches farther than mechanism. Even when a natural explanation is available, the older story still glows around it. Human beings seem to prefer layered truths. We like a fact that can also become a symbol. We like a ruin that is at once geological and emotional. Atlantis stands in that layered place. It is a question and also an image, a possibility and also a warning, a lost sight and also a kind of inward landscape. We do not need to choose only one way to hold it. The bedtime imagination can dwell there without urgency. It can move slowly through the corridors of possibility. It can pause over the thought of an island nation rising from the sea in some distant age, perhaps with terraced walls, with wide plazas, with fountains fed by careful engineering. Many ancient cultures understood water management as a form of civilization itself. To guide rivers, collect rain, dig canals, or build reservoirs was not merely practical. It was an expression of order. It was a way of saying that people could live with the land rather than only upon it. In a story like Atlantis, water is not only the element that destroys, it is also the element that makes the city possible in the first place. There is an elegant symmetry in that. The same force that nourishes can also take back. Springs fill basins, storms alter coasts, harbours open trade and later invite submersion. Human settlements, especially those near the sea, live in negotiation with change. Even the most enduring stone city depends on conditions that are temporary. Atlantis, whether literal or allegorical, reminds us that stability is often just a longer pattern of balance, one that can quietly shift. Ancient storytellers understood the emotional usefulness of vanished places. A lost kingdom lets the listener feel both wonder and ache without needing to solve anything immediately. It creates a spacious kind of sadness, one without sharp edges. The city is gone, but not emptily gone. It remains surrounded by thought. That thought can be inherited. It can be retold in a different language. It can be polished by centuries of commentary. It can appear in a philosopher's dialogue, a Renaissance map, a speculative essay, a novel, a painting, a film, a game, or a child's first wonder-filled question about what lies under the ocean. Each retelling adds a little light, and each light changes the shape of the dark. Sometimes the lost city is imagined as a warning against pride. Sometimes it becomes a symbol of advanced knowledge that vanished. Sometimes it is treated as evidence of an ancient catastrophe. Sometimes it is simply a beautiful uncertainty. The adaptability of the myth is part of its survival. A story that can be carried by many different hands has a better chance of reaching the future. In that sense, Atlantis is not merely a ruin. It is a vessel. It has carried philosophy, speculation, and longing across time. The concept of a hidden past beneath the sea has deep roots in many cultures. Flood myths appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Hebrew scripture, in Greek tales of Deucalion and Pyrrha, in stories from India, in traditions from the Americas, and in many other parts of the world. These accounts are not the same, but they share a quiet recognition that water can reset the world. Floods level distinctions. They carry away roads and fields and boundaries. After the water recedes, the survivors must begin again. A lost city, then, is not only a place of ending, it is also a place where memory begins to matter more. Atlantis is especially compelling because it is not just sunk, it is organized, it is patterned, it is a civilization with geometry in the imagination, rings within rings, channels, bridges, walls, temples. The mind naturally lingers over such structure. A ruin of random stones is one kind of mystery, but a submerged city with deliberate design invites another kind of listening. It asks what kind of people built it, what they valued, how they saw the sea, how they understood their place in the world. These are old questions, the kind that do not need quick answers, and because they do not need quick answers, they are suitable for the hour before sleep. The ancient world itself contains many atmospheres that feel nearly tidal in their quietness. The harbours of the Aegean, the island cultures of the Mediterranean, the trading cities that linked languages and goods across water, Bronze Age societies with their palaces and workshops and storerooms often seem to hover between myth and history. We know them through fragments, tablets, frescoes, ship cargoes, broken seals, worn stairways, soot on wall fragments, the remains of wine jars and grain bins. From these fragments, whole worlds can be dimly reassembled, not perfectly. Never perfectly, but enough for the imagination to rest among them. One can think, for example, of the palace culture of Crete, with its storied labyrinth and sea-oriented reach. One can think of Thera, where volcanic forces transformed a thriving settlement into layers of ash and silence. One can think of coastal ports throughout the ancient Mediterranean, where trade moved as naturally as weather. The past is full of places that were once vibrant and are now partly submerged, partially buried, or known only from their outlines. Atlantis joins this broader family of lost worlds. It becomes part of a real historical pattern, even if the city itself remains elusive. This is perhaps one of the gentlest things about historical mystery. It teaches patience. It teaches that not every gap needs to be filled at once. It teaches respect for incomplete evidence. Scholars debate, compare, revise, and sometimes simply wait for new discoveries to appear from mud, sand, or sea. The unknown is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is a place where thought can move slowly and carefully, as if walking through a darkened archive with a single lamp. And in that archive, Atlantis has a special shelf. On one side there is Plato, whose philosophical aims shape the story. On the other, there are later writers who expanded or located the city in different ways. There are medieval maps with strange landmasses at the edges. There are early modern speculations about sunken continents and forgotten empires. There are modern proposals tying the legend to real events, from volcanic destruction to lost coastal settlements to imaginative geographies now obscured by time and sea level change. Each proposal says something about the age that made it. Each theory reveals not only a place imagined, but a thinker imagining. That too can be a calming thought. When humans look for Atlantis, they are often also looking at themselves. They are asking what they fear losing, what they hope may survive, what ancient greatness means, and whether civilizations are more fragile than they appear. They are asking whether progress can be undone, and whether the sea remembers more than we do. They are asking how stories hold together after the facts have thinned. These are broad questions, but they do not have to feel heavy. At night, they can become soft questions like stones smoothed by water. The sea around Atlantis is often imagined as deep blue or green-black, but at the edge of sleep, it can become almost a color of thought rather than sight. A shade that suggests depth without demanding detail. Under that surface, one can picture columns draped in silence, fish weaving through collapsed archways, fine sediment drifting over mosaics, see grass moving in the current like slow breath. There may be shells nested in cracks. There may be coral on the remains of a terrace. There may be pieces of pottery buried where a market once stood. There may be no city at all, only the idea of one. In each case, the image remains serene. Old myths often describe the sea as a border between worlds. Above it is the visible life of humans with all its errands, labor, and speech. Below it is the region of depth, secrecy, and transformation. Atlantis, as a submerged kingdom, rests exactly on that border. It is half in history and half in the symbolic underworld of the ocean. This liminal quality is one reason it survives so well in memory. A city on dry land can be charted and fenced. A city beneath the waves remains forever a little beyond reach. It invites contemplation instead of conquest. There is also a quiet tenderness in the idea that something human-made can become part of a larger natural rhythm without being wholly erased. Stone houses become reef-like forms. Harbor walls become shelter for marine life. Human paths are softened by silt and current. What was once engineered for commerce or ceremony becomes habitat for creatures with no memory of the builders. The sea does not hate the city, it simply continues. In that continuation there is a kind of impartial mercy. We can imagine the last days before the legend if we allow ourselves a slow fictional hush around them, the weather changing, the tide rising a little higher than expected, the sound of water in the channels becoming strangely loud. Perhaps not a single catastrophe, but a chain of pressures, a long decline, a worsening of conditions, a failure of defences, the slow surrender of a low coastline to the sea. Or perhaps the tale is simpler in its symbolic form, a moral collapse so complete that flood is the only image large enough to hold it. Either way, the result is the same from the standpoint of memory. The city is taken, the people become a story, and yet even stories can be a kind of survival. A society that disappears entirely leaves little behind, but a society that leaves behind a tale continues to influence minds long after its physical end. That may be the deepest and quietest form of persistence. A story does not need walls. It travels in speech, in ink, in translation, in paraphrase, in whisper. Atlantis has crossed this threshold many times. It has been read in classrooms and libraries, in studies and bedrooms, by people searching for proof and by people content with wonder. It has entered the common treasury of the unreal, where symbols rest alongside legends, and where some of the most enduring human ideas live most calmly. The ancient world teaches us how often beauty and fragility stand together. A vase survives millennia because it broke in a way that let it be buried. A papyrus survives because the air was dry. A wall painting survives because it was hidden. A name survives because someone repeated it. Atlantis, strangely, survives because it was never pinned entirely to a single place. It remains mobile in thought, and mobility can be its own kind of preservation. There are moments in the history of thought when a concept becomes larger than its origin. Atlantis is one such concept. It has become a shorthand for lost knowledge, submerged civilizations, catastrophic endings, and the dream that somewhere beneath the ordinary world there may still be traces of a more splendid one. That dream is not necessarily false. It may simply be human. We are animals of memory. We build, we lose, we remember, we reimagine. We look at a coastline and wonder what lay beneath it before the sea shifted. We look at a broken column and imagine its painted brightness when new. We look at an old text and hear, faintly, the voice of the world that made it. And then, because the hour is late, the mind can begin to let go of effort. It can stop asking whether Atlantis was here or there, whether a volcano, a flood, a war, a collapse, or a philosopher's invention lies behind it. It can simply rest with the fact that the story has remained. That is enough for now. The sea has accepted its mystery. The scholars have continued their careful work. The myth has done what myths do best. It has carried meaning farther than certainty can travel alone. Somewhere far below, in the imagined quiet, the city remains arranged in circles of darkness and silver faintness. A broad avenue ends at a closed gate. A waterway bends around a stone quay. A temple roof is glazed with the dim memory of stars. No one hurries there. No one is asking for explanations. The place is complete in its incompleteness. It waits not for rescue but for the turning of dreams. And the dreamer too may drift without resistance. The questions can be put down like lanterns on a shore. The old names can soften into rhythm. Plateau, island, temple, canal, wave, ruin, echo, deep silence. Each word becomes gentler than the last. Each image loses a little edge. The sea becomes less like a mystery to be solved and more like a blanket laid over the world. So Atlantis continues, not in noise but in hush. It continues in the careful work of historians, in the patience of archaeologists, in the speculative edge of myth, in the blue stillness of imagined water. It continues in the knowledge that some stories are meant less for conclusion than for companionship. It continues as a place that cannot be entered and therefore never fully exhausted. It continues as a lesson in how to hold a beautiful uncertainty with a steady hand. And now, with the world growing quieter, the lost city may sink a little deeper into its own peaceful dusk. The currents move softly around its unseen towers. The old canals fill with silence. The distant harbour forgets its names. Above, the night remains broad and calm. Below, the legend rests where it has always rested, in the depth of time, in the depth of water, in the depth of the mind, and in the deep, slow comfort of sleep. Beneath that comfort, there is still room for more wonder, though it need not be a restless kind. It can be the quiet wonder of a hand brushing dust from an ancient tile, or a diver pausing above a stone wall and noticing the curve of a corner that once belonged to a home. It can be the wonder of learning that the oldest stories are often not loud stories. They are made of preserved fragments, of partial names, of ruined thresholds, of spaces where something once stood and now only air remains. The real world is full of these gentle absences. Along shorelines, entire settlements have been lost to time and weather. Rivers shift their beds. Earthquakes change the shape of a coast. Harbours silt up. Islands sink slowly or seem to sink because the sea rises around them. What feels legendary is often only history seen from a distance. A harbour from one age becomes a submerged field in another. A bustling trade road becomes a line of stones beneath reeds. A palace courtyard becomes a basin that holds rain for a little while, then disappears again into the ground. The earth is never still for long, and the sea is patient enough to keep every secret for centuries if it chooses. That patience is part of what gives Atlantis its particular mood. It is not merely a vanished place. It is a place imagined after loss has already happened. That matters. A ruin seen while the stones are still standing is one thing. A ruin seen only in the mind is something else entirely. Atlantis belongs to that second kind of ruin, the kind shaped by longing. It is less like a discovered site and more like a memory of a civilization no one can quite verify. Because of that, it can hold many moods at once. It can be the warning of a proud society undone by excess. It can be the dream of a perfect order drowned by time. It can be the quiet hope that somewhere beneath the visible world there are still untouched records, still unread inscriptions, still streets waiting for a patient light. The old Mediterranean world from which Plato drew his tale was itself crowded with stories about vanished peoples and sacred places. Greek myth was full of islands that came and went, cities hidden by gods, palaces under the sea, and realms that existed only at the edge of maps. The sea was not simply water to them, it was a moving boundary. It separated known land from whatever might lie beyond, and it also connected distant cultures through trade, sailing, war, and travel. On that sea moved ships carrying olive oil, pottery, grain, wine, metalwork, and ideas. The world was both smaller and larger than it seemed. Smaller because a ship could carry a person from one familiar shore to another in a manageable number of days. Larger because each shoreline might hold a language, a ritual, or a memory unlike any other. So when the story of Atlantis speaks of an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, it does not feel strange that the mind would linger there. Beyond a threshold is one of humanity's oldest imaginative landscapes. Beyond the mountain pass, beyond the desert, beyond the sea, beyond the last charted point, there may be a kingdom with laws unlike ours. There may be splendor, there may be danger, there may be wisdom forgotten by ordinary time. Atlantean legend, whether literal or symbolic, sits within that ancient pattern, and yet the brilliance of the tale is that it does not remain only a distant fantasy. It also turns inward. Plato places Atlantis in a moral frame, and because of that it resembles a polished mirror more than a simple map. A mirror can reflect grandeur, but it also reflects decay. It can show order and overreach in the same glance. In the story, the city's early harmony slowly gives way to ambition. Its gifts become burdens. Its blessings become a stage for excess. The decline is not sudden. It is gradual enough to feel human. That is one reason the legend has endured. It does not merely describe a place lost to a disaster. It suggests that the seed of ruin may grow within prosperity itself, almost invisibly, like salt in stone or water in old wood. This is one of the quietest lessons in many ancient stories. Great things do not always fall from thunder. They sometimes soften first. They lose discipline. They lose humility. They become too confident in their own permanence. A city with walls, fleets, wealth, and ceremony can begin to believe that those things make it timeless. But time is not impressed by monuments. Time enters through cracks. Time weathering a stair is so gentle it may go unnoticed for years. Time is a patient sculptor. It rounds edges, fades pigment, loosens mortar, and finally leaves only the outline of a place where a city once stood. The ancients understood this in their own way. Many early civilizations were deeply aware that human greatness is temporary. Tombs, temples, and epics were often created not because people believed they could defeat time, but because they wanted to speak to it. They wanted to leave a mark that could outlast a single generation. In Egypt, stone monuments rose with deliberate seriousness, as if permanence itself could be honored into existence. In Mesopotamia, cities layered one upon another over long stretches of centuries, each built upon the memory of older foundations. In the Aegean, palaces and frescoes and carefully arranged rooms reflected societies that valued both elegance and ritual. All of them in different ways were aware that a civilization is a conversation with the future. Atlantis enters that conversation as an echo. It is not a ruin excavated from soil, but a ruin excavated from thought. That gives it a curious freedom. It can borrow the grandeur of Minoan frescoes, the symmetry of Greek temples, the engineering of canals, and the solemnity of sunken kings. It can be imagined with bronze gates, polished walls, sacred springs, and harbour rings glowing in lamplight. It can also be imagined as quieter than that, with reed beds at the edges, with gulls circling above a breakwater, with markets where fish and figs are traded beneath awnings, with children running along a quay while older voices discuss weather, harvests, and tribute. The legend can hold both majesty and ordinariness, and perhaps it is in that mixture that it feels most believable. Because real cities are not only palaces and statues, they are wells, kitchens, workshops, docks, courtyards, roads, drains, shrines, and storage jars. A civilization's life is often most visible in its smallest habits, the way a household stores grain, the way a port measures distance, the way a temple receives light in winter, the way clay is fired, textile dyed, metal hammered, bread baked, water carried, and stories told. If Atlantis existed in the physical sense, it would have had all these ordinary textures too. A lost city is not lost only in its wonders, it is lost in its routines, and perhaps that is why the imagination returns to it so often. We do not merely want the tower or the throne, we want the whole vanished rhythm of life. There is something especially tender in imagining the daily quiet of a place that no longer exists. A morning in Atlantis might have begun with the sound of steps on stone and the smell of wet stone after sea mist. Traders might have unrolled cloth on the edge of a square. Priests might have washed their hands before ceremony. Fishermen might have mended nets while talking softly about winds. In a home near the water, a bowl might have held olives, and a child might have watched the reflections of sunlight moving across the ceiling. Nothing in these scenes is extraordinary, and yet together they would have made a world as complete to its people as ours is to us. That completeness is what makes loss so moving. When a city disappears, it does not vanish all at once from the lives of its people. First there is warning, then disruption, then the difficult knowledge that something once familiar may not return. A shoreline that changes after a storm is unsettling because it rearranges memory. Paths no longer meet where they did. Stones that marked a turn are gone. The smell of salt reaches places it never reached before. In the case of a great disaster, the change could be profound and final. History knows many such losses: coastal settlements overwhelmed by waves, harbour towns abandoned after eruptions, places that remained underwater after a sudden land shift. Other places simply receded into legend because records were sparse and memory was fragile. This is one reason why Atlantis can sit so comfortably beside real archaeology. Archaeology itself is an art of respectful incompleteness. The excavator rarely finds a whole city shining in the sun. More often there are wall lines, broken vessels, post holes, ash layers, shell deposits, foundations, drainage channels, beads, bones, and fragments of painted plaster. From these pieces, an entire social world must be carefully inferred. A cookpot can suggest diet, a seal can suggest bureaucracy, a shrine can suggest belief, a buried road can suggest traffic and planning. The work is slow, exacting, and humble. It does not promise total certainty. It listens to what remains. And because archaeology listens so carefully, it also teaches a gentler form of imagination. Not the imagination that invents without restraint, but the imagination that is disciplined by fragment and trace. This is a beautiful way to think about Atlantis too. Even if the city itself never existed as described, the human reasons for inventing it are real. People have always needed stories to hold their thoughts about greatness and downfall. They have always needed images for the fear that prosperity may not last. They have always wondered whether an older wisdom was once known and then lost. Atlantis becomes a vessel for those concerns, much like a clay jar can carry water long after the hands that shaped it have gone. There are other lost and half-lost places that seem to live in the same family of thought. Lyoness in the Arthurian imagination lies beneath the waves off Cornwall. Wise in Breton legend is drowned after a fatal opening of its gates. The city of Heracleion, once thought entirely mythical by some, was found beneath the Mediterranean after being submerged for centuries. Dwarka, sacred in Indian tradition, has been explored underwater with ongoing debate about interpretation and chronology. The submerged structures near the Gulf of Cambay, the undersea remains near Pavloptri in Greece, the sunken traces of ancient harbours and ports around the world, all suggest that the sea has indeed kept many chapters hidden. Some are stories, some are sights, some are a little of both. It is perhaps fitting that the boundary between legend and evidence is often gentle rather than sharp. A story can point toward a place without naming it precisely. A place can accumulate story until it becomes larger than its physical remains. When divers report walls under clear water, when sonar reveals strange outlines on the seabed, when erosion exposes a harbour that no one had noticed before, the feeling can be almost mythic. There is a brief moment in which the past seems to lift its face. Then the hard work resumes: dates, layers, samples, maps, comparisons, cautions, debates. The mystery does not vanish, it becomes more specific. That specificity is one of history's most soothing gifts. It lets wonder become steady instead of frantic. Atlantis, despite all the speculation, remains a model of unresolvedness. It has resisted closure for more than 2,000 years. That may be because it is not merely a puzzle. It is a shape into which many questions can be poured. Was it a memory of the Thera eruption and the changing world of the Bronze Age Aegean? Was it a philosophical allegory using a convincing foreign setting? Was it inspired by older Near Eastern flood traditions or the broader human habit of imagining a great civilization undone by water? These questions continue, and perhaps they should. The best mysteries are not always the ones that end. They are the ones that invite careful thought again and again, each time slightly differently. There is a pleasure in that repetition. On a quiet evening, one can revisit an old myth and notice that the details now feel different from how they felt before. A line that once seemed dramatic now seems solemn. A description of a harbour, once merely decorative, now calls to mind the engineering labour required to build it. A mention of rings and channels and walls and towers becomes less like fantasy and more like a testament to human planning. The legend grows richer when it is revisited slowly. It begins to sound not just like a story about disappearance, but like a story about aspiration. What did the people of Atlantis wish to make if we grant the story a breath of possibility? They wished to shape a complete order. They wished for beauty joined to strength. They wished for a city that could mirror the heavens and command the sea. This is an ancient desire and not an unreasonable one. It appears wherever people believe that architecture can hold a society together. But architecture can only hold so much. It can organize, shelter, and symbolize. It cannot forever prevent the turning of seasons, the fatigue of institutions, the rise of rivalry, or the surprise of nature. A harbor wall can be built to withstand storms, yet storms will continue to arrive. A political order can be polished to a shining surface, yet human pride may still find its way in. A temple can be repaired, painted, and enlarged, yet even holiness lives within time. The finite condition of all things is one of the oldest truths, and one of the quietest. Ancient people did not need modern science to recognize it. They saw crops fail, empires rise, riverbeds change, and dynasties end. They saw that every age is temporary. Atlantis condenses that recognition into a single image of submergence. Submergence is a powerful word because it describes more than physical sinking. It can mean forgetting. It can mean concealment. It can mean a world covered over by later worlds. In that sense, every old city is partly submerged. Streets are buried under newer streets. Temples become foundations for churches. Houses are built atop ruins. Names are preserved in records no one reads. Archaeological layers resemble the pages of a long book whose middle has been water-damaged, whose edges are frayed, whose chapters overlap. One civilization rests literally upon another. In Rome, in Athens, in Jerusalem, in Alexandria, in many older cities of the world, the present is a careful negotiation with the past beneath it. There is a soft melancholy in this, but also a kind of reassurance. The past is not gone in an absolute sense. It continues as material, as trace, as influence, as inherited shape. Our languages carry older words. Our calendars keep ancient arrangements. Our stories preserve moral patterns from long ago. Even our ideas of ruins and lost cities are themselves inherited from earlier imaginations. Someone long before us once looked at a broken wall and felt a similar stirring in the heart. That feeling has been repeated through time until it feels nearly timeless. Atlantis is part of that repetition. It is an emblem of our habit of seeing what is absent and giving it a place in the mind. The sea, meanwhile, remains a perfect companion for this kind of thought. It is never quite the same and never entirely different. Its surface changes constantly, but its depth gives the impression of continuity. To watch water is to watch form become formless and then form again. Waves gather, rise, break, smooth out, and gather once more. Light on water is a language of interruptions. Reflections appear and vanish with the movement of air. Even the horizon behaves like a promise that cannot be kept. So it is no wonder that the sea has become the great setting for disappearance in myth. It makes visible the idea that things can remain and vanish at once. The underwater world also has its own quiet dignity. Even without myth, it is full of hidden landscapes. There are seagrass meadows moving in slow currents, reefs built by patient organisms, fish that flicker like bits of bright thought, shells accumulating in pale drifts, and deep places where sunlight never reaches. Human ruins beneath the sea become part of that world. Their edges soften, their surfaces grow furred with life. A fallen column may become a resting place for small creatures. A broken stair may hold a little sand. Nature does not erase, it incorporates. That is another gentle truth. The sea does not always destroy in the way imagination fears. Sometimes it transforms. A site that once held ceremony and commerce can become habitat, and that new role has its own calmness. This transformation is part of why underwater archaeology feels almost dreamlike. Divers move through a suspended silence where every gesture must be measured, every disturbance minimized. The work is slower than in open air. Visibility can be brief, conditions uncertain, and patience essential. A stone set in silt may reveal a boundary, a pottery shard may confirm a date, a line of posts may suggest a pier. The sea keeps these things, and when they are found, the discovery often feels less like conquest than conversation. One asks the past a question, and the past answers with a few grains of sand shifting in the current. In a bedtime frame, that answer can be enough. It does not need to resolve the whole puzzle. It can simply remind us that the world is wider in time than it is in any single moment. A person lying in bed may think of Atlantis not as a challenge but as an image to drift toward. A ringed city underwater, a priest on a marble stair, a harbour full of quiet ships, a central hall with polished floors, a garden enclosed by walls that once caught the sun. Then, slowly, the details blur into calm. The walls become outlines. The outlines become impressions. The impressions become a feeling of depth, and the feeling of depth becomes rest. There is also the matter of how legends change as they travel from one age to another. In the ancient world, a myth might be told to warn, to teach, to entertain, or to preserve a local memory. In later centuries, it might be retold as a philosophical model, a political analogy, an occult symbol, a utopian dream, a colonial fantasy, an artistic motif, or a speculative historical thesis. Each retelling adds a layer without necessarily removing the old one. Atlantis has been especially generous in this way. It has been a literary device, a cultural obsession, a scholarly problem, and a setting for countless imaginations. Yet through all those transformations, the core sensation remains strangely stable. A civilization seen from the shore after the tide has gone out, leaving only proof that it was once there. Perhaps that is why Atlantis can feel so peaceful despite its doom. It has already passed into symbolic time. The terrible event has happened, but it happened long ago, and now what remains is reflection rather than fear. That distance softens the story. We are no longer standing in the moment of collapse. We are standing after it, listening to the waves. The tragedy becomes contemplative. The loss becomes spacious enough for thought. In that spaciousness, one can notice the shape of moral questions, the beauty of old architecture, the persistence of memory, and the strange serenity that comes from accepting that no city, however splendid, is exempt from change. The ancients, with their festivals and calendars and sacred processions, often made room for this understanding. Many ceremonies were ways of marking cycles rather than denying them. Planting, harvest, mourning, renewal, and remembrance all belonged to a rhythm larger than individual will. A city could celebrate its founding, honor its dead, and ask the gods for protection, but the very existence of such rites reveals an awareness that prosperity is not guaranteed. Atlantis, with its ritual kings and layered rings of water and land, feels like the sort of city that would have understood ceremony deeply. If it was imagined by a mind familiar with sacred order. If it was inspired by real places, it was inspired by worlds where religion, governance, and landscape were closely entwined. That intertwining is another ancient feature worth lingering on. For many early societies, the natural world was not merely background. It was partner, ancestor, witness, and deity. Mountains were not just geology. Rivers were not just water. Islands could be places of divine arrival or divine punishment. The sea could grant riches and demand payment. In such a world, a sunken city is not merely a geographical event. It becomes a theological one. To lose land to water is to confront the possibility that the world's boundaries are more fragile than they seem. Atlantis carries that theological weight even in secular retellings. It asks whether human pride can overstep the order of things, and whether a civilization may be judged not only by its power, but by its character. At the same time, there is something quietly democratic in the way ruins treat greatness. A palace once abandoned loses its privilege. A common house and a royal hall both become shells. Frescoes flake from noble walls just as paint peels from modest ones. Moisture does not distinguish between classes. Root, salt, and weather are indifferent. In that indifference lies a certain peace. The world equalizes its remains. Atlantis, sunk beneath the sea, is not a court anymore. It is a field of stone and sediment. Whatever titles it once held have dissolved into geology. Only memory can restore the names, and memory is a gentle, imperfect tool. It is fitting, then, that so much of what we know about ancient places comes in fragments. A single carved piece can suggest a myth. A piece of pottery can reveal trade. A damaged inscription can reveal a ruler, a tax, a dedication, a prayer. History often arrives like this in partial light. We assemble what we can and accept what we cannot. Bedtime itself can feel like that kind of assembly, as if the day's many impressions are being gathered into a smaller and more forgiving shape. Atlantis suits that process. It is a story that can hold fragments without demanding that they become final answers. And so the city can continue to shimmer in the mind without effort. Its walls do not need to be measured exactly. Its harbor does not need a definitive location. Its temples do not need to be reconstructed down to the last tile. Enough remains for the imagination to rest among the possibilities. Perhaps one ring held markets and another held gardens. Perhaps the center housed the sacred hearth of the rulers. Perhaps the outer waters were crossed by bridges lit at dusk. Perhaps the inner sanctum carried inscriptions to the sea and sky. Perhaps all of this is invention, yet invention itself can preserve the emotional truth of a vanished world. The feeling that people once lived there, hoped there, feared there, and made a home there under the same sky we know now. That shared sky is one of the oldest comforts. Above every lost city there remains the same turning of stars. Above every drowned road the moon still rises. Above every ruin clouds still drift. The heavens do not forget a place because it has sunk. They continue their slow measures. Sailors of antiquity read those measures carefully. Farmers, priests, and travelers all knew the importance of the seasonal heavens. In some myths, a civilization's downfall is reflected in the sky. In others, the sky remains indifferent, which can feel even more moving. Atlantis, imagined under a star-filled night or beneath a bright noon, is still under the same dome of time as every other human place. And time, in the end, may be the truest ocean of all. We move through it as ships move through water, carried forward by currents we did not create. Some moments are shallow and bright, others are deep and nearly silent. Some memories skim along the surface, others settle into the lower places and remain there for years before they rise again. The story of Atlantis lives in that deeper layer. It is not likely to disappear because it is not held in one medium alone. It lives in text, image, conjecture, scholarship, and dream. It has become part of the ancient furniture of the mind, as familiar in its mystery as the idea of a lost key at the bottom of a drawer. If there is any final lesson to rest with, It may be that not every enduring story needs a confirmed origin to be meaningful. Some stories survive because they express something perennial: the desire for hidden knowledge, the sorrow of lost worlds, the caution against pride, the reverence for civilizations that came before us. The fascination with water as both giver and taker, the sense that beneath the visible surface of life there are still unvisited rooms. Atlantis gathers all of these in one soft, blue, reflective place. So let the city remain where it is most peacefully kept, in the quiet basin of thought. Let its streets be lined with still water. Let its temples hold only filtered light. Let its harbors open onto nothing but calm. Let its names grow faint and harmonious like music heard from a neighboring room late at night. And let the listener drift with it unhurried, away from the need to solve, away from the need to choose between fact and legend, and toward the easier wisdom of simply being near the mystery. In that nearness, the sea no longer presses, it cradles. The lost city no longer calls, it breathes softly in the dark. The old world does not demand attention, it settles, it rests. Its stones, whether imagined or remembered, are finally still. And as the imagination grows quieter, Atlantis can sink with dignity into the blue remainder of the night, leaving only a hush, a shimmer, and the gentle certainty that some places are meant to be visited by sleep.